Okay, so this is a bonus video, but I thought it might be interesting for those of you who are wondering um, why this is related to philosophy or why, all the symbolic logic stuff is a philosophy class. And so I thought I would record something that just explains it a little bit. Um, so first of all, I will say that there are professional academic philosophers. They may be your professors, they may be professors in other universities, they may be graduate students, whatever, who study logic itself because they care about figuring out good reasoning, what it means to reason well. Um, and so they'll study this logic stuff that we've been studying very carefully at very high levels. They'll have lots of disagreements about what is good logic and what isn't, or what kinds of logic are useful when, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one group of people. There's also philosophers in the past and today who do what's called philosophy of math, and for them, they're studying the ways that we can think about math, what kind of truths math produces, what we can know from math, how we reason in math, and for them, this logic stuff is also very important because you can use some more advanced logic tools, like what's called set theory, to give like formal definitions of stuff in math. And that's very cool. But we won't be talking about that. We're just going to be talking about how philosophers might use the tools of symbolic logic in their day to day life if they aren't working on logic or on math, but anything else. So, how is all of this related to philosophy in a general sense? Well, philosophers, as you will hopefully all know if you've taken any other philosophy classes, use arguments to try and find answers to all kinds of questions. And these questions can be ethical. They can be about how to live a good life or what are good or bad actions. The questions can be metaphysics. They can fall under this field of study called metaphysics, which is about the underlying nature of reality. So what is real, what isn't, what it means to exist, stuff like that. Sometimes philosophers also want to discuss questions in like epistemology, which is the study of knowledge. So they want to figure out what kind of things we can know, what it means to know something, etc. And in all those fields, they're using arguments, right? And considering what kind of conclusions seem best on the basis of different arguments. So philosophers in general want to make sure their arguments are valid. And we know we've looked at logical validity a lot, right? Like it's been very omnipresent in our course, right? And we know that an argument is valid when, if all its premises are true, its conclusion has to be true. And, we've used logic to look at when arguments are valid, right? Now, logic won't necessarily tell us when an argument is sound, which means it's valid and all its premises are actually true. But it can help us show when they're valid, at least. Now, as we saw way back in lesson one, natural languages like English, for example, but other ones too, whatever other natural language you think of, they can be ambiguous, they can be imprecise. Sometimes it's hard to know exactly what the argument is saying or whatever. So we might want to use our formal language, which is more precise and more standard when we're considering an argument, right? Because that will let us have less ambiguities, less uncertainties, less imprecisions in the language. So our formal language and logic can help us avoid some of the issues in natural language, and it can let us test whether an argument that's being shown to us is valid, because we have a couple tools already to test whether an argument in our formal language is valid. Okay, so now let me show you all of this in examples. So, suppose another philosopher, we're going to start with this argument. It's very easy, simple argument. It's very clear, but it's just an example. You could use a more complicated argument if you wanted one that was more vague, and you could do all the same stuff, but I'm just showing you a very simple one to start with. Okay, so suppose you're in a philosophical argument or something, and someone gives you the following argument. They say, well, Socrates must be mortal. That's their conclusion. And their premises are, because Socrates is a man, so that's one premise. And two, if Socrates is a man, then Socrates must be mortal. So that's their other premise, right? So they have two premises. They have Socrates is a man, and they have, if Socrates is a man, then Socrates must be mortal. And they have this conclusion, Socrates must be mortal. So that's an argument they give you, right, in English. Now, as philosophers who have studied logic, for example, we know that there might be some ambiguities in natural language. I mean, in this case, it doesn't seem like there are, but we're concerned there might be, let's say. Well, then we might want to break this argument into something more precise, like our formal language, right? We want to take the two premises here. Socrates is a man, and if Socrates is a man, then Socrates must be mortal. And we also want to take the conclusion Socrates must be mortal, and we want to put it into our formal language. So we would create a translation scheme, just like we've been looking at whenever we do translations. In this case, we might say, well, P means that Socrates is a man, and Q means Socrates is mortal. That might be our translation scheme that we use. And then we would translate each premise and the conclusion into our formal language using our translation scheme. And then we would want to put it in an argument form because we're going to want to consider if the argument is valid, right? So we would look back at our premises. Socrates is a man. We would translate that, and we would get P, right? That's one premise. And then we would say, well, we have this other premise. If Socrates is a man, then Socrates is mortal. We have that as a premise, so we would translate it into our formal language. And we would get if P, then Q as our other premise. And then we would look at the conclusion and we would see, oh, the conclusion is Socrates must be mortal, or Socrates is mortal. And then we would translate that into our formal language as the conclusion, right? And there we've used our translation skills from our studies in symbolic logic. And you can see we've put the whole argument into this symbolic language, our formal language. We've shown it as an argument form. But we still want to check if it's valid, right? Well, conveniently, with our logic tools, we have two ways of testing validity of arguments. We have derivations, which we've seen a lot of, and truth tables, which we've just added on somewhat recently. And we can test whether the argument is valid and using either of these tools, right? So if we want to do it with derivations, well, what we do is we consider the argument, and then we do a derivation on it. Can we derive the conclusion Q given the premises? Well, how would we test it? Well, we use the premises in our derivation system as premises. That means we treat them as if they're true. And then we see if we can derive the conclusion Q. And if we can, then that shows, well, whenever the premises are true, the conclusion will be true as well. All right. So we do a derivation. This one is very simple. We want to show Q. We have P and if P then Q. So of course we get Q by modus ponens, and then we close the derivation. So this shows that the argument's valid, right? When you have those premises, you can get the conclusion. So we've tested, if you go way back, we've tested this English argument with our derivation, right? We translated it and then we stuck it in a derivation. And we found out the argument form is valid. That's great. And we can do, instead of derivations, we could do the same thing with truth tables, right? So we set up our truth table using our premises and our conclusion. We fill in all the lines, and then we see if there's any line where all the premises are true, but the conclusion is false. And you can see there isn't. On any line where the main operator of the premises is true, the conclusion is also true. And so there's no line where the premises are all true and the conclusion is false. And so we know that this argument form is valid, right? We used we took this English argument again, right? We used our translation tools to translate it into our formal language. And then we stuck it in our truth tables and we tested it for validity. And look at that. We found out that the argument is valid. It's logically valid. Every time that the premises are true, the conclusion will be true as well. So we know that the argument is valid by using a truth table. So yeah, anytime the premises are true, we've shown with two different tools that the conclusion will have to be true as well. And so we know that the argument that we gave in English is valid. It's great. Now in philosophy, if you want to know whether the conclusion is actually true, you still need to find out if the premises are actually true. But you know now that if the premises are actually true, the conclusion has to be true as well, right? Because we tested if the argument was valid. So if we find out that there's still problems with the argument, we know that the issue is with the truth of the premises, not with the actual reasoning, right? Not with the logic of the argument. We know that the logic is valid. It's logically valid argument. So if there's any problems with the argument, it will have to be with the premises, the truth of the premises. But at least using our tools of logic, we figured out that the argument is valid. Now, if you also learned quantified predicate logic, you may not have if you did a compressed semester. You'll be able to use the tools for sentences that have quantified claims as well. But this is just to show you the idea. And again, we used a really clear and easy example of an argument, but you could do this with very complicated arguments with as many premises as you want, for example. And then you could test the argument for validity using derivations and truth tables, and you would translate it into a formal language and then stick that in our truth tables or our derivations and test it for validity, and you would get the same stuff, right? Great. So that's how you can use the tools of symbolic logic if you're just doing philosophy generally and you want to consider the strength of arguments. Okay. Now, some potential issues with using logic this way. Well, sometimes people disagree about what a good rule of inference or a good derivation rule is. Like our rules like modus ponens or modus tollens or double negation introduction or so on. And if you think a logic system that someone has made has bad derivation rules, you won't trust it to check for validity when you're doing derivations, right? Because they'll think, this rule of derivation doesn't make much sense. So the fact that, an argument was valid using this rule of derivation might not convince you if you don't accept the rule of derivation, right? So for example, if for some reason, you're someone who thinks that modus ponens is a bad derivation rule, you won't trust this derivation as a good test for validity, right? Yeah, and it's true. Logicians do argue about what are good or bad rules of derivation, but I've taught you the classic ones, the common ones that you'll have in most logic systems, so there you go. And another potential issue is that with truth tables, sometimes people disagree about what should make a claim true on different lines of a truth table. So for example, we have an inclusive or, right? Anytime at least one side of the or symbol is true, then the whole sentence is true. But some people don't like that. They prefer an exclusive or. So that means the or claim as a whole is only true if just one side of it is true and not when both are true, right? So if you think that, you won't trust our truth tables to test for validity because you won't like the way our truth table system treats the or symbol. So yeah, that's why logicians disagree about the way that our symbols should be treated. But again, in our course, we learned the most common approach, the most classic approach to the truth table rules. Okay. So those are some potential issues. Logicians continue to debate about these things. But the point remains that, if you have a logic system that you trust, and you have reasons for trusting it, you can use it to test the validity of arguments given in English or in other natural languages. So there you go. So I hope that this helps explain a little bit how the symbolic logic stuff can be useful in philosophy. It seems a little divorced from normal philosophy at first, but I hope that this shows why philosophers might find it valuable to learn symbolic logic.